Now you should be able to see that. I think you can. Is that right, Kate?
Yeah, it should be there. I can see it.
Okay. So let me just say that here we are in the lockdown and slump. And at the moment, according to the latest estimates, there's some 2 billion people across the world now living in some form of lockdown as a result of the pandemic, almost a quarter of the world's population. And there may well be more over the next month or so. And the world economy has really never seen anything like this. And that's why I want to concentrate first on the economy before we get fully into discussion about the pandemic. Nearly all the economic forecasts for world GDP this year are for a contraction over the whole year of something like 3 to 5%. That's a situation that is way worse than the Great Recession of 2008-9. And certainly in the 2 quarters that we're now entering, we're going to see an unprecedented contraction in world GDP in all the major economies. It's a contraction which, according to Kenneth Rogoff, the former IMF chief economist in the FT, said today, is the biggest and fastest contraction in world GDP in 175 years, which gives you the indication of the chasm which the world is going in. The OECD reckons that the fall will be on average for most economies 25% over the next couple of quarters, and it will affect 1/3 of all the sectors in the major economies, so that there will be a drop in annual GDP growth of 2 percentage points for every month that we're locked down. Considering that most G7 economies have only been growing at 2% or less, that means you can see if this continues for any length of time, there will be a significant contraction in national output in all the major economies around the world. Here's the OECD's actual graph showing various countries and the likely fall in GDP during the period of the lockdowns and containment measures, whenever they come to end. That's the OECD's estimate, something like 25% fall for the US and even higher for other countries, Germany up at around about 30% and so on. And this is a real major shock to the supply of an output in the world economies. It's a supply shock. Most times we're told about crises under capitalism being caused by a collapse in demand or a financial crisis. This little graph shows you that in this case, from the shutdown of manufacturing from the pandemic, it starts with supply and then moves on to demand when people don't have any money to spend, even if they could. And then we get the stockpiling of goods. Then we get the demand collapse around the world through trade. And maybe that will then spread on to the financial crash as there's a loss of confidence and a loss of companies start to default on their debt and banks found themselves in trouble. It's a shock in the mainstream economic terms because as far as they're concerned, capitalism motors along nicely and occasionally gets hit from the side, the broad side, from a shock. While those of us who consider that capitalism has an endemic and inherent contradiction which leads to regular recurring crises would not use the word shock. But nevertheless, this graph does show you the direction of how things are going. A huge drop in supply leading to a collapse in demand and trade, and possibly with defaults and bankruptcies to the collapse in various financial institutions as we progress. Of course, governments around the world and central banks around the world are trying to avoid just that result, that it hits the finance in particular. So we're seeing huge injections of credit and money that we've never seen before at the levels of trillions of dollars being piled in from the central banks of Europe, Japan, and the United States and Britain. And alongside that, of course, an attempt to avoid the demand shock by huge injections of straightforward cash, or at least that's the plan, of increased unemployment benefit, special payments for people laid off from work by their businesses, and grants and loans that may not have to be paid to businesses and small businesses so they can get through this pandemic. What it demonstrates, a supply shock, is a very simple idea, which people seem to have forgotten, that as Marx said, every child knows that a nation which ceased to work, I will not say for a year, but even for a few weeks, would perish. And if everybody stops work, nothing gets produced. Only labour creates value. This is something which apparently has been lost in the minds and thoughts of certainly mainstream economics and so on, where apparently we're told that it's finance that does everything wonderfully, that it is capitalists investing who create value, when in fact we can now see very easily, if nobody works, nothing gets produced, and that's what brings about end to value. A very simple idea, which is certainly more than 150 years old, more like 200, and yet has been forgotten, but has been revealed by this particular crisis. Just a quick quote from Owen Jones, the Guardian journalist. I like the way he put it. Get rid of all the cleaners, rubbish collectors, bus drivers, supermarket checkout staff and secretaries, and society grinds to a halt. On the other hand, if we woke up tomorrow morning to find that all the highly paid executives, management consultants and private equity directors had disappeared, society would go on as before and probably quite a lot better, which demonstrates what this pandemic has revealed to us about the nature of our economy and who runs it, who makes the value. But it has been a dramatic drop. Here is the latest figure for the US job losses in the last month, the month of March. We had a drop of 700,000 jobs in 1 month. And as you can see, the average growth before that was between 150 and 200,000 jobs a month. We haven't, that drop in 1 month matches anything that came about in the Great Recession of 2008-9, and that's just 1 month. We're now entering the worst period. April will be worse, May will be worse, and so on over the next period in the US. Unemployment benefit claims in just 2 weeks rocketed from around 250,000 in previous weeks to 3.3 million in the week beginning March the 22nd, and then the last week before tomorrow's figures, 6.6 million applying for unemployment benefit in the US. 10 million people, in other words, out of work and looking for some benefit. I just hear that their attempts to claim the new special payments are just collapsing. US Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said on Friday that all the people had to do was go on their computers and press a button and they tick a box, and their money would be coming to them in the form of a check or a bank transfer. Apparently, when everybody did that, the whole thing crashed. Nobody could get their payment claims put through. They're now queuing in various parts, counties around the US, not keeping social distancing as they desperately try to get written forms to fill out. There's no staff to process this because public sector workers, civil servants and state sector workers have been decimated over the past 10, 15 years. And there's no staff to actually process all these claims and get this money out, both to small businesses and to employees as well. And it's not, if that's bad enough in the major capitalist economies, but outside the major capitalist economies, in the world of the emerging markets, as they're so-called, the global south, the poor and impoverished economies around the world, which constitute more like 5 to 6 billion people, millions of jobs have already gone. The COVID crisis has already knocked down 6.7% of all working hours. It's equivalent to 195 million workers losing their jobs in terms of hours already in the various sectors around the world, as estimated by the ILO this week. And global unemployment is expected to rocket by the International Labour Organization. Incomes will be decimated. They estimate that at the worst end of the scale, $3.4 trillion worth of money will disappear for people who are most impoverished around the world, who are in working poverty over this period. Dramatic reduction in incomes for millions and millions of people around the world while this pandemic lockdown takes place. The position for American workers, for example, is that more than nearly 60% will be unable to pay their rent, their groceries, or take care of their bills if this lockdown lasts for 30 days or less, according to a new survey. And 1 in 5 workers have said they've been unable to meet their basic financial needs in less than 1 week under the lockdown. So the situation is absolutely dire, and there doesn't seem to be any possibility that governments, despite their claims and despite their motions and legislation and speeches, are going to be able to avoid deprivation and destitution for millions in the advanced countries, let alone the third world. About 1/3 of American households have already lost pay income since March the 1st, with little sign of getting those checks in the post yet. And that particularly hits those people who are at the bottom end of the income scale. Here is a measurement I've got hold of today, which shows by age that those people who are in the youngest age group, under 25, they're expecting an income loss during this pandemic of 50%. Those of us like myself who are living off their nice state pensions and so on can only expect a 30% fall. So we're obviously a lot better off, but the more you have to work for a living, the less your incomes are going to be lost and dropped. The working status and emotional well-being of people around the world now is really damaged. In the US, for example, we forget that most people in the key working jobs have to continue working. The lower income groups, 26% of those asked in the lower income groups are still working. Only 3% can work from home, and the rest have been laid off. If you go to the best paid people, 26% are working normally, but 39% can work from home, and there's less of them being laid off, which is an indication of how the impact of this pandemic affects the people who are most least able to protect themselves. What I want to argue very briefly, everybody, is that this pandemic appeared to be a shock, but as I said before, I don't consider it a shock that was not going to lead to a recession anyway. In my view, it was a tipping point because the global economies, the major capitalist economies, were already beginning to get into trouble. Several of them were in recession. Japan was in recession. Some of the global south economies like Argentina, South Africa, Mexico were already in recession. The Eurozone was close to it. Even the US was slowing down to under 2% growth. Everywhere, it looked as though we were heading in 2020 to what you might call the normal recession that capitalism has every 8, 10 or 12 years. But this pandemic then came along to tip us over so much more quickly and so much more in depth. Profitability was already low globally in the G7 economies. You can see it's really historically low, despite the fact we talk about big profits for the big companies like Netflix or Amazon and so on. For the vast swathe of companies around the world, the rate of return on their investments is really quite low, which is why there's been a transfer of what profits there is towards financial speculation and unproductive areas of investment like property, rather than into productive areas, because profitability is relatively low compared to where it was back in the 60s, for example. And recession was certainly coming. The global profits, on my estimates, were hitting zero and going below even before the virus came along. So in my view, we have to remember that this is not a bolt out of the blue. This is not an asteroid out of the sky. This is something which has just tipped the global economy into this slump, which has now been intensified by the containment and by the pandemic lockdowns. Corporate debt was racing upwards anyway during this period of low profitability. So there's loads and loads of companies out there with huge amounts of debt. And this shows a figure of the debt to revenue ratio. Revenue is now disappearing and you're left with that debt. Sure, banks may not try to claim on that debt over the next couple of months, and governments may try to help them. But large numbers of companies, in my view, are going to go bust. We've already begun to see that in the UK and the US with various travel, leisure, and retail companies going under, reasonable sized ones already, and then all the myriads of small businesses around the major economies who will not open their doors again as a result of this lockdown. Huge amounts of debt have built up, particularly in the most risky and weakest companies. That's the BBB in this graph and below, rather than the best companies down the other end, AAAs, as their credit ratings are. Those companies haven't got huge debt, but there's a whole swathe in the middle in companies that have debt, which they're not going to be able to finance when this pandemic lockdown is over. And then we have the other huge fall in oil prices, which is a double whammy to emerging economies at the moment. They have seen a dramatic drop in their commodity prices. A lot of those economies depend on selling oil, selling industrial metals, selling agricultural staples. Those prices have collapsed, trade has collapsed, and in this situation, emerging economies are in deep, deep trouble. As you see, their debt has gone up in the last 10 years to 180, 170% of GDP, while their growth rates continue to fall back. That scissor is an indication of where the emerging economies are heading if this pandemic lockdown continues indefinitely. Now, can I just briefly say, Chair, that about the pandemic itself. This is an area, obviously, where we're all learning. We're all becoming epidemiologists and whatever the word is, and biologists. We're all experts now. Every day on Twitter and Facebook, I listen to a myriads of arguments and projections by different scientists. And so I'm trying to feel my way through this, and I'm hoping that our web seminar here will help me too, if there's any experts out there. But what I can see, this is the evolution of pandemics. This is how the form it takes. It starts off at a low level and then zooms up in the levels of infections and reaches a peak and then starts to come down. And we can see this is a few weeks ago where everybody might be placed schematically in the major countries that we look at and how that pandemic's gone. So the aim of health authorities and scientists and governments has been, when they realized that their health systems weren't going to be able to cope with this pandemic, spreading across an unknown virus that they've not known before, which is way worse than flu, as I'll explain in a minute. They and the health systems wouldn't be able to cope in most countries. They came up with the idea of flattening the curve. So rather than the peak being sharp, like the red line at the top there, going to a huge level, lots of in cases, deaths and health systems overwhelmed. If you put in containment and lockdown, you can flatten the curve, the blue line, so you stretch out the impact of the virus on cases and deaths. It may take longer to go away, but it doesn't hit you quite so quickly, and health systems can get up to steam in order to deal with the cases that arise. That's the plan. But one of the results of that economically is the bottom half of this graph, provided for me by Stavros Mavroudoulias from Greece, is that the flatter you do with the health medical curve at the top, the steeper you make the recession curve through the lockdowns at the bottom. So if you did nothing and let the infection spread across the world as you like, then the recession will be less. There still would be a recession because of the hit that it would take to human beings around the world and the loss of employment, but it will be less. However, if you apply to flatten the medical curve, you then make the recession curve even deeper, even longer, and therefore more damaging. And that is the dilemma that most of the economies of the world are in now, choosing between these two things. They haven't been able to resort to what is called the herd immunity solution, letting it happen until it goes away, because they now realize that health systems cannot cope. It's not significant on this graph, but which countries are able to reduce the amount of deaths and cases that they've got and be able to cope are those countries where acute beds per 1,000 people on this particular graph, there are other data as well, are the highest. Those that are in real deep trouble are those that have cut their health systems to the bone, have created conditions where basically health systems, I remember 15 years ago in the case of the UK, under Labour government, we were told, and the Blair kept brought in a market economy, we're going to make the health system more efficient, we don't have all this waste, we've got a lot of old people, we need to make it more efficient, so you maximise the amount of use of the health system, you reduce your investment, you keep your staff to the barest minimum. The result is that most health systems are working at 99% capacity before they get a flu epidemic in the winter, or they get this pandemic, and then, of course, they're completely overwhelmed. Look at this, what's happened to NHS beds in England, going down from around 300,000 in the late 1980s to half that, or less than half that now. It's an indication that no way were the major health systems of the world capable and able to do anything about it. So now we're beginning to see a plateauing of the death tolls and the infections. It's already happened in China, South Korea, but even in the places that have been hit hardest, Italy and Spain are beginning to plateau. That's not yet the case for the US and the UK. And the talk is that by the end of this month, maybe at the latest, they'll be plateauing and the flattening of the curve will be achieved. But you can see, if you just look at the line from China, there's still a very, very long way to go before you can start removing the lockdowns. China's only just removed it from Wuhan today. And you can see how long that's taken, 70 days or more since the outbreak began in China. And most other countries are only about 30 or 40 level. There's still at least a month, maybe longer, on the lockdown. And then there is still the problems of coming out of that lockdown. I want to finish, Chair, by reminding ourselves that this was expected. There's been a lot of warnings from biologists and scientists about the hit that these viruses are going to have through what has happened over the past 20 or 30 years in the industrialization of agriculture and in the moving closer to wildlife and areas of the wilderness, bringing these dangerous pathogens into contact with human beings. But nothing was done. It was ignored. The risk was ignored. The world was at risk, said the UN in its Global Pandemic Monitoring Board just in September. Again, nothing was done. Nothing was done to prepare for this pandemic, from moving from bats to humans, whatever other animals may be involved. And this pandemic, this virus, is way, way more dangerous than flu. I hear talk from President Trump and others, well, it's just another flu. Well, those are the basic scientific things. That the infection nature of this is more than double that of ordinary flu. The incubation time takes longer, and therefore it's more dangerous because you don't get it. It continues longer and will affect more people as a result. The hospitalization rate, according to what we have now, is way, way higher than it is for flu, although many more people get flu in a year and many more people at the moment die from flu. The fact is that this virus is way, way more dangerous. The mortality rate is probably at least 10 times higher than flu. And if there was no attempt to control it, it would have been presumed a complete disaster. So I just want to note the lessons from this in my last minute. It's capitalism that's generating these crises, not nature as such. Environmental pollution, industrial farming, climate change, pandemics are all connected together through the drive for profit by capitalism in agriculture and industrialization of the world and urbanization of the world and the way it's been done. The market's not working, it's not solving this crisis, it's not dealing with the pandemic in a way which will save enough lives, it wasn't prepared for it, and now it's in chaos in trying to deal with it. It's exposed that those who matter in this world, or those people who provide the jobs, are also the most undervalued in the system, paid the least, disregarded the most. And that is something which has been revealed by this pandemic. And what else can government say now? That we don't need a free public healthcare system with massive public investment in research and the production of medicines and vaccines to protect human beings and for that matter nature as well. How can we not do that after what has happened in this pandemic? Yet that will be argued by those that are still in power at the moment. And until we have a socialist economy democratically run and internationally coordinated, then we will face more pandemics and more shocks to the capitalist system over the next period.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much indeed, Michael, on behalf of us all. So now we've got half an hour for questions and contributions. There are 32 of us on the call, on the seminar, so obviously please be disciplined. Now, we don't seem to have on this version the electronically putting your hand up function. So that means what I would like to ask you to do is just send me a message in chat with your name, saying that you'd like to make a contribution. You seem to be able to put your hands up. Oh, yeah, okay. So where you're putting Peter and Len, you just put your thumbs up. Was that saying you wanted to speak, or was that an accident? Okay, so let's, no one's telling me they want to make a contribution, so maybe I will ask, yeah, okay, so you can just indicate, because I think I can probably see you all on the screen, or you can put it on the bottom, put it on the chat. But Michael has said he would like 3 contributions at a time, and then he will respond to your comments and questions. So if you could just each...
got one there, didn't we, Kate?
Pardon?
Brexit.
Yeah, so I'm just going to... So I see David Hemson who would like to contribute. Then I can see Joseph and Fiona. Okay, so I'll unlock you 3. So David, let's see. Okay, that's the challenge, to find these people.
You've got 30 screens in front of you.
Yeah, so Fiona, I'm going to take you. Oh no, here's David. David, go.
A little parochial, maybe, Michael, but I really appreciated your other writing on the crisis as it affects, let's call it, the emerging markets.
Yeah.
And everyone on the left in South Africa is putting forward big demands on government and saying, why don't we do this and why don't we do that? But actually, the shock and awe budgets or the recovery programs, which are possible in the States and in Britain and maybe in parts of Europe, just don't seem to be possible because of the enormously high interest rates on bonds, or printing money would lead to very quickly to a rash of inflation. But I wondered if you could just give a little more understanding of the constraints of capitalism in developing countries and how we should respond to that. Yeah?
Okay, thanks, David. Joseph next, and then Fiona.
Yeah, 2 short questions. One is, I noticed on the graph for job losses, the highest region affected were the Arab states. I mean, obviously that to do with the oil industry, but I just wanted to ask you a bit more about that. And secondly, you pointed out towards the end about the pandemic in the graphs, again, the contrast between containment measures and the economy. Is this causing the tendency for some states to refuse to introduce containment measures or to delay introducing them?
Okay, thanks very much. Fiona?
Yes, thanks, Kate. I just wanted to say, I think in terms of the goals, that
Oh, sorry. sorry.
Yeah, okay, I'll just start again. I was just saying, I think in terms of goals in this pandemic, the crucial thing is to save as many lives as possible. I think that the death rate in Europe and the US is terrible. In per capita terms, it's much, much worse than what's happened in China. And I think the goal that is being advanced to flatten the curve is wrong. It needs to be crushed. This disease needs to be smashed, not flattened. And I think that the experience in China is precisely that. They took a very strict lockdown, which we're not seeing the likes of that in the UK, certainly not in the US. And within 6 weeks, we went from a peak of 3,887 cases per day down to 0. And just yesterday, they had 0 deaths. So I think there's a lot to learn from China. I don't think the measures being taken in the West are remotely adequate. And that is particularly true in the US and the UK, where the lockdowns are completely lax and partial, and this is a threat to lives. So the sooner we take the full recommendations of the World Health Organization, the sooner that the curve can be completely smashed, not just flattened.
Thanks, Fiona. Michael, do you want to come back on those now?
Yes, because I think that Fiona makes an excellent point that none of these lockdowns outside of China are really being effectively applied. Can I add to that there are a couple of countries that haven't had to use lockdowns? That's basically South Korea, tiny Iceland, and until recently Japan, although that's now changed. And the reason for that in the case of South Korea and Iceland is that they had massive capacity for testing, contact and tracing, and therefore they were able to implement straight away and isolate those people who had become infected and quarantine those people who could be infected, but now we know it's mainly old people like myself, so that they were able to contain the virus to some extent that way without resorting to a lockdown. But all the other countries have been unable to do that. And then they're faced with the dilemma of locking everything down, which you can do in China because China's got the position where the population will be behind that, where the government can introduce and direct such a lockdown in an effective way, while over in the G7 economies, the attitude is somewhat different because it means the end of profit and business. And so there's a complete dilemma between the need for maintaining business and revenues and so on, and jobs for people, and saving lives. And that dilemma remains the battle. What we're seeing, as you said, is that some countries, people are not applying the lockdown, and certainly that was the case to begin with in the UK and the US. It was just denied that it was necessary. The case of India, where they applied the lockdown for Mumbai and then took it off everywhere else, and then they're applying it again. It's going backwards and forwards. The same appears to be in Japan, going backwards and forwards, because there is this dilemma between saving lives and keeping profits for companies going. So this is the situation. This is going to extend the number of people who die, and it's going to extend the length of the pandemic and its lockdowns, because even if some countries try to come out early, they'll probably lead to a huge increase in infections. I noticed that, remember, next week, Austria claims they're coming off the lockdown. We shall see exactly how that works out when they attempt to do that. Sweden said we didn't need a lockdown, and now they're racing along with the other countries that didn't put on a lockdown straight away, as we saw in China. So this failure to look after, to protect people is really putting profit before people, because there's a desperation on the part of governments and the capitalist companies to get back to work, to get revenues working. I look at the stock market now, it's been racing up over the last week, precisely because they believe that all this money and the lockdown will be over in a few weeks and they can get back to business as usual. I think they're going to be in for a shock. And anyway, the damage that's already been done to the economy will not make them survive. On the emerging markets, however damaging it's been in the advanced capitalist economies, as David says, it's nothing compared to what's going to hit the emerging economies, because they have no social safety net. They have no funding that they can get from either central banks or from their governments. They can't borrow at reasonable rates or nothing. Now, the Federal Reserve and other central banks are trying to get funds even to these countries through dollar swaps. The IMF says it's going to help countries like South Africa by providing extra funding, but it's tiny. And also, it's not going to be on terms which is possible for countries like South Africa to fund and then expect not to have to repay in huge debt afterwards. The clear answer in the case of emerging economies in the global south is that all that debt they've got must be written off now. It must be a debt jubilee, not debt relief, which is what's talked about, which is basically pushing the debt back further and making the interest rates a bit cheaper, but for longer term, like they have done with Greece. By the way, Greece, for example, after the euro crisis, has now got debt repayments that it will have to do in perpetuity till everybody who's currently alive in Greece will be well gone. It's going on for decades before they can repay the debt that the European Union and the Eurozone is applied to. So the answer, first and foremost, is to remove the debt burden that exists on these countries and lay the basis for providing loans and grants to these countries so that they can begin to deal with the medical crisis and then develop resources that they've got together in international coordination. There is absolutely no sign that it's going to happen.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, so I've got, well, one of you has informed me that you can actually put your hands up and then I can see you on the participants list. I can't see that function at the bottom, but if you want to indicate, please do see it along the bottom, I think it would be, and then put your hand up. So I've got 2 questions come up in chat, so I'll ask them and I'll take the next person who's put their hand up. So from Nick Jones, I've got, what would the impact of a no-deal Brexit be on this? So
whatever happened to Brexit?
And then from Jim Hollingshead, I've got, given China's probable emergence from the pandemic earlier than the US-Europe and the failure of the US-Europe to adequately address the medical issues, what do we think will be the balance of economic power between US and China? And then I've got Michael Burke to ask a question.
Hello, Michael. Yeah.
I'm just trying to unmute him. There, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, hi, Michael. Thanks, Kate. I thought it was a really, really valuable presentation and very interesting. And if there's stuff you haven't already published, Michael, on your presentation, then I'll await your blog. But if there's stuff you've already put up there, if you could drop that into the chat, I think everyone would find the PowerPoint very useful. Just a couple of things. I think the way you put it in speaking now was somewhat clearer than in one of the slides in the PowerPoint presentation in relation to profits, because you said what effectively the Western governments were doing were trading off public health against profits, and I completely and utterly agree with that. I don't quite agree with the schematic representation that you had in relation to public health versus the economy, and I think the reason is for that is we can evidence that from China, is that in terms of the very severe lockdown in Hubei province, and no doubt, let's assume there was virtually no economic activity taking place in Hubei province, that the Chinese economy will recover much quicker, and actually goes to a fundamental Marxist point that if values created by labour, if you look after labour, then you have a possibility of creating value again. And then the second thing is, I think, which wasn't part of your presentation, but I think is going to be useful to discuss if we don't do it now, but in another point, is the response of the Western governments as far as the bazooka type packages are concerned, because they're not. They're bank bailouts. So that the UK, there's 320 billion bank guarantees and 1.6 billion for local authorities who've got to cope with homelessness, free school meals, trying to help out the elderly and so on. It amounts to 24 quid per person. So it really, and similarly in the US, the 1,200 check sounds great, but that's going to be it for a lot of people, and many of them won't even get that. That's it from me.
Okay, so Michael, those 3 questions, please.
Well, just on Michael's, I mean, he's absolutely right about the bazooka payments. I've been totting up the fiscal packages from different countries. I estimate if we just look at the fiscal package, which is, by that I mean the actual spending of money either on cash handouts to people who have been made unemployed, or to small businesses, or the reduction in tax deferrals or increasing unemployment benefit, that sort of thing, which will come out of government spending, which they'll have to borrow for. That's working out at around about 3% of GDP worldwide on average, when the countries have declared such packages, which is higher than it was in the Great Recession. But when you add up all the credit packages, which the banks are going to get and financial institutions are getting, and big companies are getting in terms of loans and so on at cheap rates, guaranteed by various central banks, that's more like 5 or 6% of GDP. It's nearly double the fiscal spending. And even then, the fiscal spending, the actual $2 trillion fiscal package that the American Congress passed, 2/3 of that goes to businesses, most of which goes to big business. $500 billion is going to be handed over to the likes of Boeing, all the other travel companies, the airlines that are not working anymore. At the decision of President Trump, with nobody else having any say in how much they get. So out of that $2 trillion already just goes straight, a quarter of it goes straight to the big companies, the airlines, who've already had plenty of money before, and some businesses. The very small amount, 1/3, goes to employees out of work or to small businesses. And that's the same ratio, more or less, in the UK. So I think that's worth bearing in mind, as Michael has pointed out. On the question of what does this mean for no-deal Brexit? Well, yeah, what's happened to Brexit? Well, first of all, there's no discussion going on. So at the end of this pandemic, say at the end of this year, that was when there was supposed to be a trade deal signed up, or we were going into no deal. Will there be an extension of the discussions on trade or not? Will Boris Johnson be there to discuss the trade deal or not? We don't know, but clearly, let's just say it's extended into 2021, the trade discussion. I still remain pretty much unconvinced that there's going to be any sort of reasonable trade deal which makes any sense, even for British capital, that's going to come out of these negotiations. Every economic study shows that the leaving of the EU by the UK was going to cost the British economy something like 4 to 10% of GDP over a period of 10 years, compared to where it would have been before. But of course, these figures are all up in the air now after this calamity which has hit us in 2020. And if Kate could just remind me on the third question.
It was about the US and China.
Yes, I think that's
the balance of economic power between.
Well, I mean, this is the long-term issue before us all, isn't it? That here is China, the rising economic and manufacturing power in the world, and now rising technology power. All of those things threaten the hegemonic position of US imperialism and its European allies, and particularly the US. This is something that's got to be curbed, stopped, broken as best as possible by the Americans. They still have military and political power, they still have financial clout, and they're going to be using that to try and stop China returning to the position after this pandemic of challenging American power. Already we've seen the media claiming that the Chinese conspired to create this virus by letting it out of their laboratories. The Chinese have replied it was the Americans who started it by letting out of their army laboratories. So even on the level of the pandemic, the tensions and the rivalry in the struggle is going to take place between these two major powers, one rising and one in relative decline, but remaining politically and militarily supreme. It's the major issue of the next 2 decades, and it's also a measure of just. I finish on this point, Kate, that China, who would not be in this position if it wasn't been able to apply state direction, public ownership and planning in their economy, they would have been in the same position as India and other countries under the yoke of imperialism. Instead, they've been able to take 800 million people out of World Bank-defined poverty over the last 20 years. No other country has ever achieved that. And they've been able to create the major manufacturing nation in the world. These are facts which is very difficult for imperialism to swallow, and certainly they want the people of the world to recognise.
Thanks very much. So I have 2 more contributions, and then I think with your response as well, Michael, that'll take us up to our hour. So I'll call first Michael Wong Sam and then Andrew Bergin. So let's unmute. Okay. Okay, fire away, Michael.
Can you hear?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just two very quick points and then a question. First of all, just a cautionary thing about these countries that you said didn't have to apply a lockdown, such as Iceland and South Korea. Well, I know in the case of Iceland, actually, if you look at the number of cases and the deaths per million of population, they actually don't look so good.
Maybe so, yeah.
Yeah, in my understanding, actually the worst of the lot is Luxembourg.
Absolutely, yeah.
Followed by Iceland. So it maybe if they had applied a lockdown, then they would have fared a lot better in those terms. Secondly, I've noticed that it's already started, that the rivalry between the United States and China coming out of this crisis is already beginning to ramp up with, well, I noticed that Mike Pence said that after this there has to be a reckoning with China, which was a bit of a very blunt warning. And then 15 Conservative MPs have made this proposal that, China owes the UK 350 billion pounds, and that they're going to pursue it through the courts, through the international courts. I think that, obviously the international courts isn't a thing, because when was the last time that they actually gave a fig about international law? But I think that there is an undercurrent here developing, which will gather pace over the next period of time, to suggest that this rivalry between the United States, in particular, and its allies, and China is going to sharpen very much very soon after the pandemic, as ceased to be a question. I would, however, like you to speculate on particularly on the economic outlook after the pandemic, how that's going to look, because it occurs to me that all of the widening differentials that we've seen over the past period of time will now be exacerbated, very much so, by this pandemic, not only internationally between the countries of the north and the countries of the south, but within countries. It seems to me that the poor are actually bearing the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic, and it's the corporations which are being bailed out by the governments. So I just wondered if what is the bearing of that particular thing on the economic outlook coming out of the pandemic.
Thanks very much. And then we've got the final contribution from Andrew Bergin. Andrew, go ahead.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Michael. Thanks for a wonderful presentation to us all. It seems to me that we have to think about how the pandemic has changed everything and has changed the way in which we collectively must now begin to work. We obviously knew, you have been presenting for a while, the possibilities of recession or depression within the system before the pandemic, but the pandemic speeds all of these events up and has completely transformed the situation, the objective situation, at the time when we are only at the beginning of the pandemic. It's only in January that events began to unfold, and we haven't yet seen what will take place in the global south, the Middle East, and these countries. So it seems to me we have to begin to think about some of the political questions that arise from this and how we can work collectively together. One of the ways, and we were talking about China and the US, but it could be any country. This is what's happening within the European Union, is that there is no European Union anymore. Each country looks to its own interests. So you have the rise or the potential rise of a reactionary nationalism. And then on the other side of that, you have all of the things that we now know about, which are the solidarity campaigns and so on, the links that are now being built, for example, between bus workers in the States and bus workers here, because they face the same problem about where people get on at the bus and so on and so forth. And it seems that there is tremendous opportunities for the left now to reach out and to intervene in this, and the whole consciousness of how people have seen the world is transformed. So this is what we're trying to do with these seminars and webinars, and it's the Chilean workers, I think, have a slogan, which is, we don't want to go back to normal, because normal was the problem. And I think Aaron Roy made exactly the same point in her piece in the FT at the weekend. How do we now go forward? And one of the things that we've been thinking about and working on here is a charter of principles of protecting the people. How do we protect the people? How do we deal with the pandemic? But how do we also deal with this systemic crisis of capitalism, of capital? And we've launched the charter today. And so I would ask comrades, I think Kate's going to give the link to it at the end. I'd ask comrades, we need to begin to work together more concretely, is what I'm saying, and more openly, and it will be, that will be the basis for us transforming the situation. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. So, Michael, over to you to answer those or comment on those final contributions.
Well, I think, can I just, a couple of points came up on the chat message too, which I'll try to deal with. And perhaps I would start with those. What's going to happen after this pandemic's over economically, which is a key question for us. We've discussed some challenges that are happening between China and the US, as Michael mentioned. But first, this is going to take some time for world capitalist economies to recover from. It won't be like China, who is also making a gradual recovery. It's only gradual compared to what they normally do. But in the case of some of these capitalist economies, it's going to be very slow indeed. Even the FT said, or Gavin Davis in the FT said, that he thought it would be, we'd be back to the same level of output in the G7 by the end of 2021, if we're lucky. He said more like end of 2022. So I was thinking about that those people who were born, who are 18 years old and started work in 2007, then had the general Great Recession, then had this long depression of austerity for the last 10 years, and then get hit by a pandemic and possibly lose their jobs again. This generation is really taking a hammering through the various crises that capitalism presented. And an optimistic view that by the end of 2022 or in 2022, sometime in the next 2 years, we'll be back to the same level of production and employment, which wasn't that great, it wasn't that wonderfully normal, is really not a very optimistic prospect. And in fact, it could be a lot worse than that. Will we have a long depression? Was one chat question. Well, in my theoretical analysis of capitalism, capitalism gets out of long depressions by having a sufficiently deep slump that clears out a load of companies that don't make any profit and allows those that are more aggressive, more efficient, more profitable to take them over and raise the rate of profit for those who survive. I'm not sure this pandemic is going to deliver that sort of what was once called creative destruction to enable capitalism to have a new lease of life at our expense. It could be that it just gets dragged along in a stagnation from the next 5 or 6 years or onwards as a result of companies being kept propped up by the Federal Reserve and other central banks and government initiatives while people lose their jobs. So we could be in a position where their unemployment will stay much, much higher than it has been recently in the major economies. There even could be some inflation back because production is not moving very fast. Investment is not providing the capacity to meet even the level of demand that would exist then. So we could be in a stagflationary environment, depressed environment, which will continue for another 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ahead of us before the next crash hits capitalism. I'll just finish on this point, Kate, that in the late 19th century, we talked about a long depression or a Great Depression. Then we started with a big panic in 1873, and there are a series of booms and slumps, but generally depressed period that lasted 25 years, up until 1897, at least in the case of the United States. We're entering a period, it seems to me, after 10 years of very rather poor, mediocre, depressed growth after a big recession. Now this, we could have another 10 years of what we just had before a situation is resolved economically. Politically, well, I leave that, we had that discussion before, but I can't see that people are going to stand by and just take this hit yet again and again without the struggle developing in new avenues, in new areas, particularly in countries which are faced with life or death decisions in the next period. But that's something we need to discuss at future webinars, so I think the word is used.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed for that, Michael. I think we could probably have gone on discussing it for a couple of hours. But thanks to everyone for coming, obviously. And hopefully you won't object if we inform you of any future seminars that we have coming up. And I know Transform Europe is also doing a series of critical discussions from the left on the global crisis, so do look out for those. Andrew mentioned the Protect the People Charter. I've put the details of that, the link to that, in the chat. He asked me also to say that we're trying to get it translated into a number of languages to make it a genuinely international thing, and we've had an Italian version prepared for us today, and that's been shared around. So if anyone is willing to translate that, it's quite a short, just 6 short points. If anyone's willing to translate that, that would be very helpful. So please do sign on and share that if you can. So
I'll be putting the charts up on my blog if people want to look at it.
Oh yeah, okay, brilliant. Yeah, that would be fantastic. So what I'm going to do now, at Andrew's request, is unmute you all so you can all talk to each other if you want to. But again, big thanks to Michael and thanks to you all for joining.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, good idea.
Thank you, Kate and Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Very enjoyable.
Okay. I'll end the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.